This was not going to be a video about trying to correct mistakes that we make when we're drawing in ink. It was going to be about drawing a fancy domed building. However, I made so many mistakes drawing it that I thought I would turn it into how do we cope with mistakes? How do we compensate for them in a way where we can still continue our drawing and still end up with a profitable time spent, and also something where perhaps we can see the mistakes, but some of them or most of them aren't going to be as obvious to someone else. So that's what this video has become. So I start just with an indication of where the tree line will be, and then I start to draw this bottom drum section of the dome. It's important to get the proportions right, because if the proportions of the foundation aren't right, then as I grow the structure on top, it will not look right. It will look too tall and skinny or too wide and fat. I start with the center and I move out. I don't realize it when I'm doing it, but I make the windows to the left and the space between columns and lines just a little bit too wide, and I take the left hand side of the drum too far to the left. This means now that my drum is too wide, although I don't realize it till I finish the right hand side and get a chance to see it in detail. So now my problem is that it's too wide and squat, and it'll be hard to put the smaller drum on top and have the proportions between the two the same. To try and lift the height a little bit, I actually increase the height of the entablature, the rows above the columns, and the balustrade above it. This will boost the visual impact of this lower drum before the second drum comes on top. And while it is changing the proportions, I'm hoping it's not going to be too obvious at a casual glance. I also realized that with the extra width, my windows are too short. Now, because of the foliage, that's a bit hidden, but a few of the windows where they do go lower than the foliage, I actually increase the length of the windows just to make their proportions look a little more how they should be. I don't realize it at this stage, but I also haven't curved the top of the drum edge down on the left-hand side quite as much as I should have. And I need to preserve some of the space for this foliage on the right-hand side before I draw the drum behind it. So now, before I add the smaller drum on top of the first, I increase the height of the entablature, those rows that sit on top of the columns. And then when I draw the balustrade on top, the railing on top of the entablature in front of the second dome, I make it deliberately a little bit higher and larger than in my reference, because I'm still trying to increase the effect of the height of the lower drum. I start with the window above the window I started the lower drum with, and unfortunately, again, I make it a little too wide, because there is a noticeable difference in the width as well as the height of the windows in the second drum. And getting the balance between the two sizes correct is part of capturing the elegance of this structure. Aware that I took the lower drum too wide to the left, I try not to do that with the upper drum. Still have to align the windows to some degree above the windows below them. There's a little bit of additional decoration on the upper drum. These buttresses that curve out at the bottom dramatically. I deliberately try and bring the curve on the left-hand side at the top of the second drum down slightly more than perhaps is in the reference to visually compensate a bit for what's happening on the lower drum where I didn't bring the curve down steeply enough. After I stopped recording, I actually put another vertical line on the extreme left of the lower drum just to pull it out a bit further from the upper drum to give the effect that the upper drum was just that little bit thinner in proportion to the lower drum than I actually drew it. Now we come to the most significant mistake. I planned for the dome to be too high. This is a classic mistake. I've made it before, and even being aware of it, I still did it this time. And that horizontal line I placed to mark the top of the dome, I made too wide as well. When we're looking up at a dome from below, it in effect makes the dome look not as high as if we were viewing it side on. The fullness of the circle of the dome is still there, but more of it sits within the drum from that position. Because I've drawn my dome too high, I can't get the segments of the dome looking correct, because these ribs that I'm drawing on actually curve over out of view at the top of the dome more than I can make them curve, because the top of my dome isn't the right shape. It just goes too high upwards. Now when I look at my reference photo, I can see that there is a bit of decoration where the next segment of the dome kind of joins onto the top of the dome. So I'm hoping maybe I can hide the top of my dome within that, but it's already too large a space, so it ends up looking very overworked. I also add a little bit of extra height to the decorative bands at the base of the dome, hoping, and again, this will give the visual impression that my dome isn't as high. But really, the problem is at the top, because the proportions just don't let me get the shapes to the segments that I want. They don't curve around as enough on the sides. So I add these decorative elements above the entablatures above the columns. And now I have the decoration in the segments to draw. Now I'm not going to draw these exactly, of course, but I do want to get a sense of the symmetry of the patterns and of the general sense of the patterns. I put these little ventilation windows in. Again, I don't curve them round enough, but because there is a fair bit of decorative element, I'm able to actually move a couple of them further down and hide what I'd drawn a little bit in the decorative elements that I drew on. So sometimes we can incorporate mistakes in later lines that we have to draw. So now I come to the lantern. Because the dome is a bit tall and a bit wide where the lantern joins on, I increase the size of the lowest section of the lantern just a little bit too much. I find I have a problem of tending to make lanterns just a little bit too large than I should. And again, when we change the proportions of the key elements of a structure, we change the balance, which often contributes to the elegance and the distinctiveness of the particular structure. So getting the relative proportions of the different elements correct is important. I am determined at least to draw this top spire as nice and thin and straight as I can. And I think I managed that at least. But overall, I'm aware that I've made this section just a little bit too large. I can't hide it, so at least if it's not leaning, it won't draw attention. I always intended to draw this foliage, but now I'm very keen to have some other things in my scene to draw attention away with the mistakes I've made, particularly with that dark blotch on the top of the dome. And so these dark leaves, dark edge of a tree silhouetted in the top left corner is a very welcome part of the composition now. because it gives me a place to draw the eye. And the same is going to be true for the foliage that's beneath the drum. This is a place now where I can put perhaps a little more detail and a little darker tones in my hatching than I was going to do, because I'm actually wanting to make my main subject a little less the main subject. The more I can induce people's eyes to roam around the whole drawing, the less they will have any attention for any one spot. And that can be a very useful tool to use. Really now I'm just working back and forth in this foliage to build up the darkness. Actually, I think I was a little bit keen just to stop drawing this because it had been such a series of mistakes for me. But the next day when I was finishing this video, I went back over and worked in a bit more hatching, a bit more darkness into those trees. So if you want to go and have a look at the thumbnail photo, that will show you how the drawing finished up in the end, and with that extra lines on the left hand side of the drum as well. And in the end, I'm really glad I persevered with drawing this, because what we never want to become is precious about it having to be perfect, because if perfection is the minimum standard which I need to complete a drawing or to feel good about any of it, then I'm never going to be a very happy artist, probably not a very prolific one. We need to accept our mistakes as part of the journey.